Hey guys, I am excited to get to introduce you all to somebody that I had been hoping to have a conversation with a microphone on for a while. Lynna Sutherland is here. She's joining me. And here's what you need to know about Lynna. I was looking at your Facebook page bio, Lynna. Do you remember what it says? It says you're a mom of 8, eager to help others peel away layers of destructive ideas about parenting and church. And I was like, okay, Lynna. You have my attention. Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. The combo of ideas is because I started online life as a homeschool mom
Sure.
blogger, and now I kind of have two circles that I run in. So I guess that
hmm
bio was the best way to
Yeah.
summarize both in one shot.
Yeah. I have you here because you're a longtime PCA church attender member. PCA is the Presbyterian Church in America for people that aren't familiar with that denomination. And I think I initially discovered you on Twitter. Maybe I think you might have been trying to explain how things work with General Assembly or something. And I'm like, well, I need someone to explain this to me because I don't know what's happening. And then I was like, oh, you also do other thing. Like you also had founded the advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, where you really do combine what I see to be two passions, explaining to people how things work and also helping lay people understand how they can advocate for more healthy churches, especially when it comes to like abuse. Does that make sense? What have
Yeah.
I missed?
Yeah, no, that pretty much covers it. I think it was maybe 2022, 21. I don't know. I don't remember exactly. I just started a Facebook group to help people follow what was happening at General Assembly. And my feeling all along has been like, I'm not an expert. I don't know as much as, guys who've passed ordination exams on the BCO,
Yes.
but I probably know more than the average layperson. So I can kind of be like, I'm like one step ahead of you, so I can help you a little bit to follow. And I really enjoyed that. And I found that there was a fair amount of interest, people wanting to just be able to follow what was going on. And appreciating a little bit of insight or a place, at least a place to ask questions. And in the Facebook group, my pastor and a bunch of other guys are in there. So if there's ever anything I don't know, somebody can answer that. But anyway, the Presbyterian Church in America has a governing document called the Book of Church Order.
Yeah. The
And
BCO.
the BCO, exactly.
If you hear
And
us
it
say
is,
that, that's what that is. Yeah.
yeah, it is fairly complex. And so it does kind of create this pretty steep learning curve to understanding some things. And I don't think it's intentional. I don't think anybody's out to trick anybody, but it really does make it challenging, especially when, if you're a layperson talking to somebody who has a lot of experience and training and they're using terms like, well, strong presumption of guilt and 38-4 and case without process. And you're like, okay, I
Okay.
guess I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know what that means, but you sound like you do. And so I'll just trust you.
hmm
So anyway, I just saw an opportunity to just provide education. There are tons of resources out there that are kind of produced and written by officers of the church for officers of the church,
Yeah.
but I'm not aware of anything that's created, more for the layperson.
Yeah. I love that you are bringing your passion for teaching to another passion of your life, your faith, and how that works out. As you were explaining what you're doing, I'm like, is Lynna the PCA version of like what Sharon McMahon is doing with when it comes to government?
Okay, I'm really laughing because my sister-in-law is a huge fan of Sharon Says So, and she got me hooked on that Instagram account. And I was like, oh man, when I grow up, I want to be the Sharon Says So for the PCA.
Yeah, so here
That's
we
so funny
are.
that you said that.
As you were talking, I was like, I had already written out some questions that with sort of a nod to Sharon, where people were like, can you explain XYZ to me like I'm 5 years old? And I think that there is a need for that. People don't know what they don't know, and they need someone to be like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to open the BCO, the Book of Church Order, and figure it out, but maybe someone can help me figure out where to start and make it a little more accessible. So I love that. Also, people can become members in a PCA church without ever reading the Book of Church Order. And which is sort of wild, right? I mean, I think it's good. The membership requirements are different than everything that's laid out in the BCO. Like we have these particular processes for how we do things, but this is actually what you say when you become a member. So it's very possible someone could go about for decades in their church and never know what, all these different things are. And it's fine because it never comes up and never impacts them. But sometimes it does. And it is good to know that the Sharon says so of the PCA is here for us. I'm speaking this, I'm speaking this into being. So I want to rewind. What
Yeah.
what started this? Was there like an inciting incident that made you think, I need to do this? I need to create something for people?
Um, yeah, I don't know that I can necessarily point to one thing in particular. It was probably more just kind of like a converging of circumstances. One thing was, I did definitely have my own personal interactions with and observations with survivors and victims of abuse and watching them try to navigate the process. And I'll just say up front, I do think that a Presbyterian system of church government is rooted in scripture. I mean, I see at a bare minimum, I
Yeah.
see in scripture an indication that churches should be governed by a plurality of elders, not just one CEO type guy.
Yeah.
And I see scriptural precedent for regional leaders getting together to settle like doctrinal disputes and things like that. Um, and I do think, like as a friend said, on paper, the BCO should work, right? But
Yes.
any doctrine, policy, polity, anything like that that you have is a tool that can be used for good or ill, and it really just depends on who is wielding that tool and what
Yeah.
their intent is. And I think one of the things that I observed in the PCA, and this is a very broad brush, very generalized comment, but we came out of the PCUSA.
Hmm.
And so in part, we define ourselves as not that. We kind
Hmm.
of set up our identity as, oh, we're doing things differently. We came out of the PCUSA for a reason, so we don't want to slide into becoming those things. And one factor there was women's ordination. And
Mm.
so because that's kind of a line that we drew in the sand, then things that relate to women and that might potentially feel like women having authority or women, creeping into roles that they shouldn't have or something can raise the hairs on the backs of people's necks and,
Mm.
make people nervous. And so that really can be an obstacle when, for example, a woman who's experiencing abuse in her home comes forward, because there's a bit of this, oh no, uh, submission and authority in the home, and we don't want to mess with that dynamic. And is this person being taken over by feminist ideas? And
Yeah.
there are some kind of cultural ingredients that I think are worth considering. And I mean, it's like with anything else. Like you could say, okay, you can read the Constitution. Like you
Yeah.
can get a copy of the US Constitution. Maybe you got one when you were in fourth grade and you can read it. But
Yeah.
that is not the same thing as saying, okay, now I understand constitutional law.
Yeah.
Because obviously there's so much around it. There's so much history, precedent, trends in the past, how we interpret it, all that. And so just more and more realizing that there's so much nuance and there are so many things that you can't necessarily learn just by reading the Book of Church Order. You just kind of over time, and I would put myself at the very beginning of this spectrum. There are plenty of folks that know this much better than I do, but just developing over time a sense of like, oh, I see, this is how this section is typically interpreted or is often used. This is the problem you're going to run into if you're going to try to do this.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, it was just a confluence of seeing some needs, seeing some challenges, and an awareness that, you know, I would say my superpower is like being able to read something, summarize it, explain it, and like you said, explain it to you like you're five,
Yeah.
and helping people to feel comfortable. Like there's no dumb questions you can ask. I'll do my best, or I'll ask somebody who knows more than I do.
Right. Because it's not a reasonable assumption to think you should know all the things. That's unreasonable. It is very reasonable to have questions about this. So I'm really glad that you have said there, no shame here. It makes sense that you would need someone to explain it to you. And even when you were talking about the origin story of the PCA, I think knowing that is a helpful context for people that would want to have conversations and have some concerns about how women are handled. And knowing there's going to be an extra sensitivity to that and thinking about how to wisely navigate that, whether you agree or don't agree, is just a smart thing to do. So I want to ask you, what are the current things, the current issues you're working on right now when it comes to advocacy and education?
That's a great question. So I'll start by just sharing some of the things that we have kind of in the works or available at the moment through the Presbyterian Pew. So one is I offered some online workshops last fall, that we're going to reprise this spring. I have online courses, kind of like self-paced online, but I know sometimes for people, having something on your calendar and setting aside time for it and having an opportunity to ask questions directly
Yeah.
can be a learning setup. So anyway, we have some workshops upcoming that are, like a Zoom-based workshop to help people understand essentially like three aspects. The first is just the Presbyterian or the PCA system of government. How does that all work? What's a presbytery? What do we mean by the courts of the
I
PCA
can't
and all
even
that?
pronounce presbytery.
And then the second one is a look at the rules of discipline, which is when people think of the Book of Church Order, that's often what comes to their mind, like, oh, yeah, trials and censures and all that stuff. So the second workshop kind of covers that. And then the third workshop is specifically about General Assembly, so that if somebody's watching General Assembly on the live stream, they kind of know what they're seeing.
Yeah.
And then we also have just opened up a read and discuss group for the PCA's DASA committee report. So back in 2019, the General Assembly commissioned a group of folks to read and report back on DASA. DASA stands for domestic abuse and sexual assault. And so their job was to report on how to help the PCA to see these issues through the lens of scripture and especially the Westminster Confession, and to have like a biblical and confessional perspective on these issues. And so the DASA report was published in 2022, and it's a big document, and it's
Yeah.
organized well. It's organized topically so that, if you're dealing with a particular type of abuse, like, okay, we have a potential domestic abuse case, you can flip right to that section and get guidance on that. But it can be overwhelming to look at this big document, and do I just read it like a novel? And what if I read
Yeah.
something and I don't understand or have questions? So we have a Facebook group that we opened up for that, and I'm super excited that quite a number of the authors of the DASA report have agreed to come on. Once or twice a month, we'll have like a Zoom where folks can come on and ask questions with one of the authors of one of the various sections. Another thing we're working on right now is I've actually been interviewing pastors and elders to just kind of give us a little inside look at, okay, what's an administrative committee, and what is candidates and credentials, and what does it mean to be on the review of presbytery records, and what all does
Yeah.
that do, just to kind of give a little more human perspective on what all these committees do.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think primarily our role is an educational one. We're not currently pushing for any BCO changes. I mean, there are things that I think would be good, and I definitely have, in the past helped people to understand, look, here are some overtures that are coming forward about, say, background checks or witness eligibility, and here's the backstory of why these came to be, and here's potential objections that people might have. Here's how you can follow what's happening with the process. But we're not really spearheading any movements to
Sure. Yeah.
make
You're not
BCO changes.
lobbying.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. So what was the response then after all that work? I understand it wasn't a binding thing. It was guidance. Was there some sort of confusion over what would happen after that? What happened?
Yeah, I think there's always confusion about things like this just because we don't, as a general populace, we don't always understand how the PCA does things. But I think one thing that's important to know is that DASA is not the first study committee by far. There have been many over the history of the PCA, and the reports of study committees are always what's called pious advice,
Okay.
which means they're not constitutionally binding. They're considered this is a significant thing. It's kind of like, listen to your parents, trust your parents' wisdom. They don't have authority, but you should give them deference because they're older and wiser and they have a lot of experience. So that's the level of all of our study committee reports. So, I know some folks said, "Oh, I was really disappointed that the DASA report didn't have constitutional authority." Well, that wasn't like a unique thing to this report. None of the
Sure.
reports have binding authority. And it would be pretty difficult. The DASA report is not written in the language of the BCO. So it's not really even the kind of thing you could enforce like you might enforce another part of the BCO. So I think what the hope was that the DASA report would come out, and then the wisdom that was provided there would be used to then make some changes to the BCO. There were a couple of overtures that had been proposed before the DASA report came out. Dealing with those overtures was kind of delayed. There were some that came forward in 2021. And I believe the DASA report was originally, normally study committee reports come back after a year. So
Okay.
they were commissioned in 2019. 2020, we didn't have a General Assembly. So I think people expected that it would be presented in 2021, and they proposed overtures to kind of align with that, reveal, I guess, if you will. But the DASA committee requested an extra year. So they presented in 2022. Some of those overtures that came forward in 21 were kind of tabled until 2022 with the hopes that the information from the report would inform the discussion about the overtures. The DASA committee was not commissioned to make specific overture recommendations. They did make some recommendations, like
Sure.
general recommendations, but it was not part of their task to like write overtures or to say, we should pass these overtures. So, again, this is part of the grassroots nature of the
Yeah.
PCA. It's not like we have some big body of, leaders up top that's saying, here are the measures that we think should pass. Overtures come from, some pastor at his desk at church who's writing this, and his session proposes it to the presbytery and they send it to the General Assembly. So once the DASA report has been published, then it really is up to kind of just, your individual guys and presbyteries to send overtures to the General Assembly based on the recommendations there.
As I was thinking through this, I was thinking about how I occasionally listen to the Advisory Opinions podcast with David French and Sarah Isger. Sarah Isger often says, just a reminder, the Supreme Court doesn't decide anything other than the question before them. And I thought, well, that is an interesting thing to consider too when it comes to these processes with the PCA and what's happening with overtures. And I would, tell me if I'm wrong. I would say that an overture is very much like when somebody brings something to the Supreme Court and says, here's the question we're bringing to you. And the Supreme Court can't change what that question is. They just have to deal with the question that's been brought to them that all the other levels kicked up one at a time until it got to them, and then they decide that question. The Supreme Court doesn't just get together and write a law. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Does that
Yes.
work?
Yes. And we had exactly that kind of confusion, I think, last year when there was an overture that came up about studying the book Jesus Calling. And there were some comments about, oh, why are we studying Jesus Calling? There are other books that are worse and more problematic. Why aren't we focusing on those? Well, that's not how it works. It's not like the Overtures Committee is sitting there saying, okay, let's pick which book is the worst and we'll write an overture about that. No, the Overtures Committee is just interacting with whatever has been sent up to them.
Yeah.
So again, the PCA dealing with an overture about Jesus Calling doesn't mean the whole PCA got together and decided this is the worst book ever and that's why we have to have an overture about it. It was actually just one guy who sent an overture. It didn't even pass his presbytery, but it made it all the way to the General Assembly. And that's what the Overtures Committee does, is they interact with the overtures that have been sent to them.
Yeah. And I can see how this would be confusing. I'd have
Yeah.
to be like a legal expert to go
Yeah.
through this. Lynn, I feel like you'd be a good attorney or paralegal or something.
I think if I had the time and money for another degree, it would go more towards therapy or social work.
I like that.
Yeah.
I have considered that myself. But again, money's going for kids going to college first right now, and I feel like maybe I'll do a master's someday. I haven't done that. Speaking of therapy, I had a chance to meet Dr. Langberg.
Mhm.
She is a part of the PCA. Did she have anything to do with the DASA report? Did they? I thought I heard that in my somewhere.
Yeah, she
Yeah.
was one of the members of the DASA committee report. And as a matter of fact, I believe that the chapter or the section of the DASA report about adult sexual abuse was largely based on her work. And,
Mm,
this is another thing to know about the DASA report is that many of the authors of the DASA report are are experts in their own right and have published materials. And so a lot of that work is in some ways kind of a compilation of many people's previous work into one document that's
yeah.
specifically designed for reading by this particular audience.
Yeah. I wonder how many people realize that Dr. Langberg is part of the PCA. I mean, that's not her main goal in life to say what denomination she's a part of, but
Right.
I just have so benefited and so appreciated the long, faithful work that she's
Yes.
done. She just does
Yes.
the work before her, and it speaks for itself. In a world where so many people become like well known for who they are because they're like somebody, I really, really respect when somebody becomes well known because of the faithful work they've done. And it's the work that speaks for it. And I think that is a good description of Dr. Langberg. I'm actually gonna interview her soon about her new book. If you could ask her anything, is she gonna come and talk to you at all about the explaining DASA?
We have asked,
She's pretty busy.
yes, yeah. I mean, it's like, wow, that would be amazing, but also wouldn't fault her if she, if she
Yeah,
can't fit us into her schedule. I actually listened recently to her interview on the Russell Moore podcast.
I did too.
And I don't know, she does this balance well of like not being overly rosy and falsely providing false hope about things, but also there's bravery and there's boldness in the way that she speaks.
Yeah, and she's still in it. She hasn't given up. She is still doing the work, and I really do appreciate that. I mean, she says the things pretty clearly that she knows to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe part of it is the gravitas she has of having put in the time for so many years where, a 30-year-old couldn't just show up and say, here's how it is. And people be like, who are you even? Right?
Mm-hmm.
She can be like, I have been in the trenches with you and with women this entire time. You know who I am. You know I am not here to take down a denomination. I love Jesus. I am not part of the woke cancel culture. It's hard to paint her as any of those things if you have any understanding of her context and where she's been. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and
So,
that interview that I just listened to, I think Russell Moore asked her something like, what do we do with that tension between the scriptures call us to be on the lookout? We know there are going to be wolves among us. We have to keep our eyes open, but also we don't want to constantly be suspicious of everyone. How do
yes,
we
yes.
resolve that tension?
Yeah.
And she was basically like, in heaven. Like,
We don't.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
no, we don't want to walk around being like, oh, every person I see is a child molester. But yeah, we actually do have to keep that awareness. We can't be like, well, he's been a pastor for 25 years, or,
I know
well,
that
he
person.
has
It's
books
fine.
published and he's on the speaking circuit. So.
Yeah. That brings me to a question a more personal question, really. I think that somebody might want to ask the same sort of thing. Like, what if I just want to go to church, Lynna? I don't want to worry about if my church is healthy and if the leaders here are safe. Like, can I just do that? And how would you respond to that?
I would say yes. So here's how I've described this, because sometimes when you get deeply involved in something and you talk about it a lot, then people around you are like, oh, maybe you think I'm a bad person because I'm not
Yeah.
that involved, or I don't really care about what you're talking about or whatever. And I say it like this. I say, look, okay, we all took a vow. Those of us who are members in the PCA, we all took a vow to study the purity and the peace of the church. But I would compare that to the Great Commission, right? We are all commanded to make disciples. Now, what does that look like? I am not a missionary in a foreign country.
Yeah.
So we are all called to somehow participate in the Great Commission, but it's going to vary drastically depending on, just your gifts, your qualifications, your calling. It might be you're praying for missionaries. It might be financial support, or, there could be like a whole variety of ways. And so I would say to the person who says, I'm sorry, but I just don't really have a passion for
Yeah.
understanding the BCO, and I've heard people say, I really just want to focus my energy on my local church. I'm not super concerned about what's happening at the denominational level. My message is not, will only the most godly people follow the overtures that are coming from,
Yes.
General Assembly. It's more like, right, we all, are serving in different ways, given our gifts, given our capacity. And I think the one thing that I would ask of anyone at any level is to simply maintain an awareness that
Mm,
things may not be as they seem.
mm.
So I guess it kind of goes back to that comment from Dr. Langberg. Like, I don't wish for people to, not be able to joyfully attend worship on Sunday morning.
Yeah. Mhm.
And even though there could be things going on that I don't know about, or that I don't know about yet, I think in general we ought to want to wholeheartedly engage in worship and service and fellowship. So I guess some
Yeah, we're not
regression,
showing
like,
up with our arms crossed across our chest
yeah,
saying, I'm just waiting and
yeah,
watching.
yeah. And I
That's
and
not
I
the
do
posture.
think, I don't really know what the solution to this is, but I do think there's kind of this stepping through the looking glass experience that happens when you have experienced things going wrong in a
Hmm.
church. And it does just inextricably lead you to be more cautious and more,
Yes.
okay, in my last church, everything looked great
Yeah.
until it didn't. And so
Yeah.
now I'm looking for a new church and everything looks great here, but it looked great in the last church before we, realized that the leadership was not going to protect and support us or whatever. So,
Yeah.
I don't I don't wish for people who haven't experienced something traumatic in church to have that same level of
Right.
reservation or tension about worshiping joyfully. But yeah, just
That resonates with me. I understand that, right? Like not everybody has the same passion. But what if we valued and said, you know what, I don't have the experience that you have, but I really value that you have had that because that sensitivity is something that you will have that I won't have. And I feel like that's very much informed by a conversation I had with Pete Singer, who's the executive director at Grace. I asked him, what would you say to someone that says, well, that person's just overly sensitive? You know, they've had a bad experience and they dismiss them. And he said, here's what I'd say. I'd say there's some other guys that were overly sensitive. A guy named Isaiah, a guy named Jeremiah, we call them prophets. So this is what Pete said. And I was like, it was such a powerful thing to hear him say we shouldn't discard their accounts because of their experience. We should value them. Not that they're going to be right every time. But he said, I've had cancer in the past, so I'm going to be sensitive to things happening inside of me that feels like something's wrong. And that is a good thing. That
right.
sensitivity is a good thing. And so if somebody's listening, I just want to say, we value that. I know that tension is hard. It is really difficult, but it is so valuable. I feel like a really good, healthy pastor would say, we need you.
Mhm.
And we're so grateful that you are here.
Yeah, I think I don't want to equate this to the path of salvation, but when we hear about like one plants, another water, so you might witness to somebody and you don't see anything come of it, but you don't know how the Lord would use that down the road. So I think there are times where you speak about something and maybe there are people who are like, oh, she's woke, she's a feminist, she's whatever, and they think you're kind of kooky. And then who knows, maybe down the road they have an experience where they're like, okay, wait. Maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe I'm not alone because I do remember hearing somebody talk about this kind of thing before.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of feel like I am going to do the best that I can do to be truthful and
Yeah.
faithful and gracious and then let the Lord do whatever
Right.
he wants to do with that.
I like that. That is something that not everybody could do, right? If somebody's had a really, really painful church experience, they may not be ready to sit in a place like that or even have these hard conversations to help people try to understand. But somebody that's more regulated and outside of that situation a little more, and it isn't as damaging to them spiritually or emotionally, can sit there in that. Like Lynna, you can have relationships in the PCA and conversations with people where they kind of are like, oh, they just, they're dismissing you, and you can stay in it knowing you're okay. And maybe someday they'll change their mind. They know where to find you. Where not everybody would be able to sit in that, and it's not this is not a call that everybody has to do the same thing. So I think that's a really beautiful open hand that you're offering to people, saying there isn't one way, and we all have our
Totally.
role to play. I had asked you when I first reached out about recording, saying that I would love to have you come and talk about why pastors shouldn't be afraid of you, and you said, shouldn't they be? Tell me about your experience with how people receive you like leaders in the denomination. Your own pastors, Presbyterian leaders, even like national leaders. Are they afraid of you? What's that like?
So that was a tongue-in-cheek joke. In general, so here's the thing. In general, no, I haven't experienced anybody being afraid of me or antagonistic. There was one guy on Twitter who was a PCA pastor tweeting anonymously some pretty rude stuff. But in general, like I understand people are going to disagree with me. I'm okay with that. A couple of times when something seemed to be surprisingly antagonistic, I've said, can we talk offline? Because I don't need you to like me or agree with
Yeah.
me. But,
Mhm.
you know, I also would want us to have a mutual understanding, mutual respect for each other. And that usually goes well. I think it's just a fact of social media that you can kind of dehumanize people
Yeah.
and deal more with ideas and forget that there's a human being behind who you're talking to. I find in general, if I can have a private conversation with somebody, again, it's not necessarily that they would come to agree with my
Yeah.
perspective or whatever, but just to know, you know, I I'm not here to destroy or tear down the PCA, but I've seen too much to be like a PCA fangirl.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be this glassy-eyed, oh, just be in the PCA. We have a polity. Everything is fine here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think one of the ironies that my mom and I have talked about recently is that on an individual level, people would say like, oh yes, pointing out sin is love. That's how you love people, is you point out their sin so that they can grow and be sanctified. But we don't think that way on a institutional or denominational level. Like pointing out sin is mean and bad and you shouldn't do that. So yeah, I think we have to learn how to kind of publicly engage with the log in our own eye instead of just
Yeah.
publicly throw stones at, oh, those terrible liberals or those, whatever, the
Yeah.
left that's dragging us down. Well, okay, let's spend some time talking about our own responsibilities and our own shortcomings that we can work on.
Yeah. If you had a chance to talk with I'm going to start with men because men and women have very different abilities to serve in different roles in the PCA. If you had a chance to talk with a man who had any opportunity to be in the leadership position and said, Lynna, I really want to work for our denomination to be more healthy and a safe place for people that have been harmed. What would you say to him? How would you encourage him?
I would say thank you.
Mhm.
I appreciate that, that's even on your radar and that you care about that. I would say that the most important thing he could do is to just start in his own home, in his own congregation, if he's a pastor or an elder or something. And probably the most important thing for him is a very healthy dose of humility.
Mm.
Darby Strickland, who's written a lot about abuse and is also a member of the PCA, says that ministering to people who've experienced abuse is like doing surgery in the dark. You are going to hurt somebody. And
Mhm.
so you have to be willing to hear them when they say, ow, that hurt. And so I think sometimes the obstacle for leaders can be, it's kind of like with a parent. Like you feel like, oh, I'm in charge. And if I admit that I did something wrong, then I'm going to lose my authority here. And so I have to pretend like I know it all and I have all the answers.
Mhm.
So it can be challenging for a pastor who does genuinely want to help and steps in and tries to help and may cause inadvertently more harm or do damage in the process, to be willing to hear that instead of, kind of put up their hackles and be like, oh, I'm the pastor. You don't know. I
Hmm.
know. Diane Langberg, as you mentioned a moment ago, we think of her as this woman with great quantities of wisdom, and she definitely is, but she tells people regularly, I know what I know from listening to the
Hmm.
survivors. And so, going forward with this attitude of, Lord, help me, kind of like we say, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, like, Lord, I'm willing,
Yeah.
but I
What
also
am I
know that
missing? Hmm.
there are things I don't know and I'm going to misstep and I'm going to hurt people. And my best learning opportunity is to put aside my ego and just listen frankly to the feedback that I'm getting from this person that I do genuinely want to help. There are so many resources out there. So I think in this day and age, ignorance doesn't have to be an
Hmm.
obstacle.
Yeah.
But yeah, step number one is just to approach this realm with open ears, open eyes, soft heart, and leave your ego at the door.
Yeah. How about for women? Women have a more limited ability in leadership in the PCA. But if they want to be a part of advocating for goodness, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I think, women have a great opportunity to be kind of the first line of defense for, especially, so for example, a woman who's experiencing abuse in her home. First of all, most women don't say, I'm being abused. I probably should
Mhm.
do something about this. Instead, they're like, I don't know, something seems wrong. My marriage is
Right.
difficult. I've read the books, I've tried the things, it doesn't seem to work. And so a lot of times when women begin to reach out for help, their questions sound very normal. Like they might say, I don't really enjoy sex. And we could all be like, oh, right. Yeah, different times of the month or after you've had a baby. Yeah, that's normal, but we have to kind of have in the back of our minds, yes, this could just be a normal marriage problem, but it could also be someone who's really hurting, taking their first step out to
Yeah.
see, is this normal? Do other people experience this? And so instead of saying like, oh, yes, here's some marriage tips and tricks, and here's a book I read that was good, be willing to ask some good questions. Darby Strickland has an amazing article about this and how, a lot of those first questions seem normal. And part of that is because this is a scary topic to begin to unpack with somebody. We are very heavily trained to be super positive about your husband. Like
Yeah.
you don't talk bad about your husband, like you're his PR agent and it's your job to make him look like an amazing person.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that's supplemented with the woman at home hearing directly from her husband, like, don't you dare tell anyone about this. No, I will not go to marriage counseling. This is not the business of the church. Don't talk to anyone about this. And so she's not going to be like, hey, I have a 15-page document where I've written down all of these
Yeah.
episodes. It's going to be like, sometimes I feel nervous when I know my husband's on the way home, like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, let's talk about that. So, and I also think, it depends on the church and the church culture, but, um, you know, without needing to be ordained, there are many ways that women can serve and advocate for one another. Interestingly enough, there's been a recent amendment to the Book of Church Order about who can serve as a representative for somebody who's been accused.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are in a presbytery, in other words, like you're a member of a church that's a part of a presbytery, you can serve as an advocate for someone who is being accused of something. And that you don't need to be ordained to do that, but you can
Somebody that's bringing an accusation or someone that's being accused?
know someone who's being accused.
Okay.
So, for example, if a woman leaves an
Okay.
abusive situation and then her church is bringing her up on charges,
Yeah.
like we're gonna discipline you because you left your marriage.
Yeah. Hmm.
Right. So yeah, that's an important distinction. Not an advocate for, you can, I mean, you can be a friend and a support to anyone in
Yeah.
any
Hmm.
situation.
Oh, that's helpful. I think sometimes we think that in order to have any influence, we need to have like, I've been appointed to be a deaconess, or I've been appointed to, a committee. And just knowing, educating yourself on certain things is going to make you be ready to be a good friend to somebody who doesn't even know. I mean, I think a lot of women that are that have experienced domestic abuse do not know that it is that, because they don't know it's normal and they haven't been educated on that. Somebody doesn't have to like physically leave a mark on you for it to be abuse. Or domestic violence is, there's a whole range of things. And being a person that knows that, maybe you'll be a more safe person for someone to talk to than, because you aren't the main person in charge of something. You're a friend, you know, someone sitting at Bible study with them, or sitting across the aisle from someone that they are like, oh, I've talked to that person before. I think they're
Mm-hmm.
friendly, they're kind.
Mm-hmm.
They'll probably listen to me. That's not nothing.
Yeah.
So I live in Thompson Station, Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, just south of Nashville. Have you been following any of the happenings in the Nashville Presbytery? Do you have any thoughts on it? Any of the things in the news?
Yeah. So,
Been
I
kind of
think
a rough couple years.
it has been a rough couple of years. Yes. I think one of the things that is important for us to observe is that the Book of Church Order can be used to handle even cases of spiritual abuse. So, I think the Scott Sauls case was much more, we weren't talking about like embezzlement, we weren't talking about physical or sexual abuse, we were
Right.
talking about, a bully pastor, basically. I was not directly involved with any of that. I don't have any of those details, but I do think it helps us to see that we do have the capacity. It's not as though, like, well, there's nothing in the Book of Church Order about this, so we can't do anything. It can be handled through the policies and the polity that we have. I think with the Ian Sears case, one thing that brought up
Whoa.
is the difficulty with things being handled informally
Hmm.
versus formally. Most presbyteries have a committee that's called something like a shepherding committee, or the minister in his work, or something like that. And their job is kind of like what it sounds, to shepherd pastors, to handle, like, if there's a dispute between, with two congregations or whatever, those kind of shepherding roles. And so there have been a number of cases, not just in the Nashville Presbytery, but there have been a number of situations where something came up, whether it was like a letter that was sent, or just kind of knowledge of a situation arose, and it was handled by the shepherding committee. So it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, we'll just talk to him. He says everything's fine. Okay, we've handled it.
Yeah.
And the difficulty there is that, first of all, Ian Sears was on the shepherding committee. So there's just a kind of an obvious conflict of interest there. But also, sometimes things that are handled by the shepherding committee are not going to have the same kind of documentation and paper trail. And I think even if something happens that, okay, you don't, this isn't something somebody needs to be deposed or excommunicated for, but it did rise to the level of, the censure that we call rebuke, basically like an official statement of, hey, not cool, don't do that again. If somebody's had like 3 or 4 rebukes for spiritual bullying, that matters, right? So
Yeah.
here's now it's not just one thing, not just one person. Now we have a pattern. And so if it's handled by the shepherding committee, and they just kind of have an informal chat with somebody, we might not have that kind of record of like, okay, this has come up multiple times, multiple different unconnected people have raised these concerns. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of some of the SBC's issue with communicating, and the resistance, to be like, well, it's not really our responsibility to tell everybody about the things and like what's appropriate to share and what isn't appropriate to share. But man, hearing some of those accounts, I was like, that was such a safety issue.
Yeah.
That there were some egregious issues happening with Sears,
Yeah.
and he was able to just move along. And Yeah, I'm curious if anything will come of that, if any overtures will be inspired by situations like that about how to handle sharing of information or what happens.
Yeah, I mean, when a teaching elder transfers to a different presbytery, there is supposed to be, and I think usually there is communication. The receiving presbytery would speak to someone in the dismissing presbytery. Is there information here we should know? But again, if nothing formal has happened, then the dismissing presbytery may kind of be in a bind, like, well, I have personal opinions, but I don't know if
Yeah, yeah.
how much of that do I share, and there's nothing on paper that I could say, yes, here's a document of this case that we dealt with this person. And I think another layer of that is also, how much does a congregation have a right to know?
Oh, yeah.
So,
I know that's so tricky in
just
this
thinking about,
with
like,
the way
if
our churches
I
are set up.
was a member of that church and I found out, like, okay, so, at least his wife and the shepherding committee of this presbytery knew that there were, credible allegations of sexual misconduct. And
Yep.
I, as a congregant, have been sitting in these pews Sunday after Sunday with no knowledge of this, no warning, nobody let me in on the fact that this was being looked into. That would be pretty frightening.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And it's, I mean, in this day and age, like, for example, this wasn't a PCA issue, but Stephen Lawson, serious things happen to the level where he's being kind of erased from websites and ministries that he's been a part of. And yet no formal statement had come out from his church about what actually was going on. I feel like that's the responsibility of a church. Not, we don't need all the details. That's not everybody's business, but there should at least be some kind of formal statement. Hey, we're the people who are in charge of shepherding this pastor. We've kind of vouched for him as somebody who
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
person of Christian character. And now it's our responsibility to publicly kind of pull back that validation and to speak clearly. Again, I'm not saying we need all the details and all that, but just like, this is what he was disciplined for, or this is what he's being investigated for.
Yeah.
And so it becomes increasingly important in an age where a, a man's ministry may extend beyond just the walls of the congregation that he's pastoring. He could have YouTube videos and books and online presence and that kind of thing. And so
Yeah.
there does become a broader responsibility. It's very tricky, of course. I don't mean to say that
I
this
mean, you
is
don't want
a
to get it
simple
wrong.
thing,
The
but
stakes are
yeah,
really high, right?
right,
I
right.
appreciate that. Like it is a heavy thing to say, I think I need to share this information a little bit more widely. I think that's another thing that I would encourage people in leadership or aspiring to leadership to just understand those dynamics of what it takes for someone to say something. How likely is it it's made up? You know, reach out to somebody and say, tell me what it looks like. What are the patterns to look for in someone that's a tricky person that maybe
Mhm.
isn't like full over the line, like sexually abusing, although you want to look for those signs too. But what are just some signs to look for in a tricky or somebody that might not be the best person to choose for an opening in our presbytery? We don't know what that looks like necessarily if we're not in that world, but to find someone that is would be really good. I highly recommend it. It's hard
Yeah,
to reach out. I think in denominations, especially, it sometimes can be hard to swallow your pride and say, what if it isn't somebody in our denomination, right? Would I be willing to trust guidance and expertise from somebody that isn't a member of my denomination?
right. Yep, that's a great question.
It's tricky. I am not a longtime Presbyterian. I have no Presbyterian background. And like lots of people, we had some hard church experiences and I had a pastor that plagiarized every word of every sermon he ever preached. And we ended up leaving that church. And in, 2021 or so, we started attending a PCA church, not because we were like, yay, PCA, but it was because a friend that I trusted said, I've been going to the church. I really like it, and we're going to actually be moving into our own space, not at a hotel every week where we set up. We're like have a physical location that we're in every week. Why don't you visit? And we did, and we loved it. But we came with that like, I don't know what's happening, and I don't know how who to trust, and I'm not sure, and I want to take it seriously. As somebody that usually was somebody who just jumped in head first, I'm gonna sign up for all the things. It was really hard for me to just sit and be and not be a member. I'm not a member. Like I still feel the tension, Lynna, that like every time they ask if somebody wants to be go to the membership class and become a member, that I'm like, I don't know. I want to mean it if I say those vows. And I don't know if everybody defines the purity and peace of the church the same way. And what if they think that I'm out to take them down because I have questions? I have questions. I have lots of questions. And so it's been sort of a tension to sit in. Should I be a member, Lynna? Tell me.
Um,
What
I
about
cannot
speak to
answer
the
that
person like
question
me
for
that's like, I don't know, should I take it's, PCA membership is a vow. It's very serious. I wouldn't
it
do
is.
it
Yeah.
if I didn't, think I could say the words and mean them.
So I would not ever attempt to answer that question for someone else, but I will
Right.
share some thoughts. On the one hand, I do, I have heard from so many people who said, oh gosh, I submitted to the government and discipline of the church and I had no idea what I was vowing to do when I signed up for that.
Yeah.
So I definitely want there to be opportunities for people to understand what it is that they're vowing. I think often, membership classes explain the vows, explain what those vows mean. But, again, like I don't know that every person who considers joining a PCA church is really going to be all that interested in learning all about, the BCO or the history of how
Yeah.
it's played out. Um,
And what
so
happens if they have a conflict with someone,
yeah,
right? In leadership.
right. And this may sound naive or foolish, but I think there's a sense in which you do as much as you can beforehand, like, and I don't actually even mean knowing the BCO. I think it's more important really to know the church and the leadership that you are, potentially vowing to be a part of.
Yeah.
You do the best that you know how to do. And then you recognize that, when I got married, when I had kids, I thought I knew what I was signing up for.
There's just no way to
But
to
there's
know
a
everything.
lot that you don't know. My husband and I did, premarital counseling. We did the things that are smart to do to try to make wise choices. And then you take a vow. I want to be really careful how I say this, but part of taking a vow is acknowledging that there are going to be worse times. And
Yeah.
so the vow is a part of saying, I'm not just here for the good parts, I'm here for the bad parts too. However, there's a difference between, oh, things are difficult in our marriage right now versus like, this is an abusive marriage where only
Right.
one person is really working on it. And so,
Right.
I think the same can be true of vows to a church. You do the best that you know how to do. There are aspects of taking vows and becoming a member of a church that can provide you with rights and protections. So, for example, like if a couple that's attending a church and the wife goes to the pastor and says, I'm concerned about my marriage, if the husband is not a member of the church, then the pastor can't really pursue like church discipline with him or anything. He's not a member. So
Yeah.
the amount of, I guess, authority that he could bring to bear in that situation is limited. Again, for anybody who has already experienced bad, church outcomes, and especially when it's had to do with membership vows, like I took membership vows, and then when I wanted to leave, they said, no, you can't. You're a member. If you try to leave, we'll discipline you. Like it 100% makes sense why anyone who's experienced that would say, yeah, I'm not so gung ho about
Yeah.
signing up for another round of this. So
Yeah.
again, yeah, those are some thoughts, but I have great
Yeah.
compassion for anybody who has reason, sadly,
Yeah.
to fear what could come of making a commitment like that.
So what things are you hopeful about right now in regard to the PCA? I want to end on a not a naive hopefulness, but like what is your hope?
Well, I do see more and more. I don't know that I could see this at the denominational level in terms of like this is an overall trend in the whole church, but I do talk to plenty of guys who are very aware and concerned about abuse and working in little quiet ways that nobody will ever see, just to love the people that are right in front of them, to learn to, grow in their awareness, to take advantage of resources. So, that is always an encouragement to me. And I do see, this is where I'm going to get accused of being a feminist, but I do see a growing swell of wise, intelligent, strong women who are saying, I want to know what's going on too. I want to understand. I want to be able to follow. I want to be able to have input. And I think, we are a body. The church is a body, and women are definitely a part of that body. And it's not a matter of like, oh, I want to feel special. I want to have a job. No, if God has gifted his church, her members that have gifts, then, we're doing the wrong thing if we are not using the gifts that God has gifted his church with. And that includes, again, women who, and I'm not talking about ordination. I'm just talking about, just like it would be really foolish for a husband not to take advantage of his wife's insights and her
Yeah.
expertise. So it is really encouraging to me to see more and more women who are paying attention and wanting to learn and wanting to be involved in the ways that they can be involved. And I think that really does make a huge difference.
Well, I appreciate that. Thanks so much for coming and chatting with me.
Yeah.
I am really grateful for the work that you're doing, and I can't wait to dig into some of your resources and hear you explain all the things about DASA and BCO, and so that I can be ready and understand what's happening myself. So thank you so much, Lynna.
Sure. Thank you for having me.